The atmosphere inside the crisp, modern television studio of the Royal Hour was usually one of polished decorum, soft lighting, and meticulously vetted talking points. On this uncharacteristically rainy Tuesday morning, however, the air felt charged with an unpredictable, almost breathless energy. Millions of viewers across the globe had tuned in for what was promoted as a rare, intimate joint interview featuring Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and her 9-year-old daughter, Princess Charlotte. The interview was intended to mark a milestone campaign for youth mental health and child development, an initiative close to Catherine's heart. Dressed in an elegant, cream-colored wool dress, Catherine sat gracefully on the plush velvet sofa, radiating her signature poise. Beside her, young Charlotte wore a navy floral frock, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking every bit the dutiful young royal, yet carrying a mischievous curiosity in her eyes that no amount of royal etiquette training could fully suppress. The veteran host, Marcus Vance, sat across from them, maintaining a warm, welcoming demeanor designed to put his guests at ease. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation flowed seamlessly through familiar, rehearsed channels. They discussed Charlotte's love for ballet, her school routines at Lambrook, and how Catherine balances the overwhelming weight of future queenly duties with the grounded, everyday realities of motherhood. Catherine spoke with her characteristic composure, artfully steering questions away from palace gossip and toward the core message of early childhood emotional support. But live television is an unpredictable beast, and no script, no matter how carefully vetted by palace press secretaries, can survive the unfiltered honesty of a child who feels comfortable enough to speak her mind. The subtle shift occurred when Marcus turned his attention toward family dynamics within the royal household, aiming for a light-hearted transition. He asked Charlotte about the upcoming holiday gathering at Sandringham and how she felt about spending extended time with her extended family, particularly her grandparents. Charlotte smiled, swinging her legs slightly as she leaned forward toward the microphone. She began by innocently describing how much she enjoyed playing with her cousins and how King Charles often read stories to them in his study. But as the host probed further, asking about the daily routines behind closed palace doors and who held the real authority when the cameras stopped rolling, Charlotte's expression shifted from playful to surprisingly contemplative. Without warning or prompt, the young princess casually dropped a statement that caused the air in the studio to freeze instantly. It revealed that behind the scenes, away from the public appearances and synchronized smiles, her relationship with Queen Camilla was marked by intense friction, describing a moment where Camilla had allegedly delivered a harsh personal ultimatum regarding the children's future roles and visibility within the monarchy. Charlotte, speaking with the stark, unvarnished clarity only a child possesses, recounted a recent, fiery argument at Windsor Castle that had left her mother in tears behind locked doors. The detailed nature of Charlotte's words, mentioning specific discussions about royal titles, strict behavioral expectations, and private conflicts over palace protocol, sent an audible shockwave through the production crew watching from behind the cameras. For a split second, Marcus Vance's professional composure faltered, his eyes widening in pure disbelief as he realized the historical magnitude of the moment unfolding on live television. In the control room, panic erupted. Directors shouted over headsets, unsure whether to cut to a commercial break or allow the unprecedented broadcast to continue. But before anyone could intervene, the camera panned back to Catherine, capturing an entirely raw, unscripted reaction from the Princess of Wales. The immaculate veneer of royal perfection shattered in real time. Catherine's face went pale, her hands visibly trembling as she reached out to gently clasp Charlotte's arm. The emotional weight of months, if not years, of guarded, unspoken tensions seemed to collapse onto her all at once. Tears welled up in her eyes, glistening under the harsh studio spotlights before spilling over onto her cheeks. For the first time in her public life, Catherine was completely overwhelmed by emotion, unable to maintain the stoic silence that had defined her public persona for over a decade. She took a deep, shuddering breath, attempting to compose herself, but the raw pain of protecting her children while navigating the treacherous waters of senior royal life was too immense to hide. The studio fell into a dead silence, broken only by the faint hum of the broadcast equipment. Charlotte, noticing her mother's distress, immediately leaned into Catherine's side, wrapping her small arms around her mother's waist in an instinctual show of comfort and solidarity. Catherine pulled her daughter close, burying her face slightly into Charlotte's hair as she tried to catch her breath. The contrast between the rigid, disciplined world of the British monarchy and this deeply human, vulnerable moment between a mother and her child played out live before an audience of millions. Marcus, recognizing the profound, delicate nature of the situation, lowered his cue cards and adopted a quiet, deeply empathetic tone, offering to pause the interview. Yet Catherine waved her hands slightly, signaling that she wanted to remain on air. Taking a tissue from the side table, she wiped her eyes, her voice cracking with raw emotion as she began to address Charlotte's explosive disclosure. Rather than offering a canned palace denial or attempting to sweep her daughter's candid reveal under the rug, Catherine spoke with a poignant, breathtaking honesty that no one in the studio or across the globe could have anticipated. Catherine cleared her throat, her hands still resting protectively over Charlotte's shoulders. The silence in the studio remained thick, heavy with the weight of an unscripted, historic moment. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the practiced, measured cadence typical of official royal engagements. Instead, it carried the resonant, steady conviction of a mother defending her home. She acknowledged that life behind the heavy, gilded doors of the royal residences was far more complex than the public ever witnessed. Without confirming every granular detail of her daughter's statement, Catherine validated the emotional truth behind Charlotte's words, explaining that navigating the rigid traditions of the institution while trying to raise grounded, emotionally healthy children inevitably created friction with the older generation of senior royals. She spoke directly into the camera, her eyes still shimmering with unspent tears, detailing the immense pressure placed on young royals from a remarkably early age. Catherine described how the demands of duty often collided head-on with maternal instincts, particularly when decisions regarding the children's privacy, public appearances, and emotional well-being were debated behind closed doors. She admitted that while Queen Camilla carried a distinct perspective forged by a different era and a vastly different journey within the monarchy, those differences in philosophy frequently erupted into profound personal strain. By speaking so openly, Catherine tore down the carefully constructed myth of effortless royal harmony, laying bare the deeply human cost of maintaining a public legacy. As Catherine spoke, Charlotte sat upright beside her, her expression changing from childlike innocence to a quiet, solemn resolve. The young princess added a few soft words of her own, explaining that she had only spoken out because she hated seeing her mother hurt, and because she believed people should know how hard her mother worked to protect her and her brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis. This addition, uttered with complete sincerity, only underscored the depth of the bond between mother and daughter. The raw authenticity of the exchange transformed what could have been framed as a sensational palace scandal into a powerful, poignant moment of family solidarity against the crushing weight of institutional expectations. Across the globe, social media networks erupted in unprecedented activity. Clips of the broadcast began circulating within seconds, trending globally as commentators, journalists, and everyday viewers debated the extraordinary scene unfolding on live television. In the studio, Marcus Vance listened intently, allowing the Princess of Wales the time and space to articulate her feelings without interruption. He asked Catherine how she managed to maintain her resolve in the face of such overwhelming public and private scrutiny. Catherine paused, taking a moment to look at Charlotte, before answering that her primary duty had always been, and would always remain, the emotional safety and mental health of her children, regardless of the titles they bore or the positions they were destined to inherit. In the control room, the tension shifted from sheer panic to a stunned realization that they were broadcasting an undeniable turning point in modern royal history. Palace communications teams were undoubtedly scrambling, but inside the studio, the narrative was entirely in the hands of Catherine and Charlotte. Catherine addressed the public directly, offering a candid reflection on the boundaries between public service and personal dignity. She emphasized that while she remained deeply committed to her role within the monarchy and to supporting the king, she would no longer sacrifice her family's internal peace or stay silent when her children's futures were caught in the crossfire of internal palace politics. As the second segment of the broadcast neared its conclusion, The emotional tempest in the studio began to settle into a quiet, resolute calm. Catherine had successfully composed herself, but the shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. The cautious, ultra-reserved royal had given way to a formidable, transparent leader who had chosen authenticity over institutional armor. She held Charlotte's hand tightly in her own, their fingers entwined, signaling a unified front. Marcus Vance, sensing that the moment called for quiet respect rather than intrusive probing, began to wrap up the extraordinary interview, setting the stage for what would inevitably be a massive, global reckoning for the British monarchy. The broadcast transitioned toward its final minutes, but the energy in the studio remained electric. Marcus Vance leaned forward, carefully framing his final question. He asked Catherine what message she hoped the public, and indeed the royal institution itself, would take from this extraordinary moment of candor. Catherine adjusted her posture, her demeanor shifting from open vulnerability to a quiet, undeniable strength. She looked directly into the primary camera lens, addressing the millions of viewers watching worldwide. She explained that true strength within any family, royal or otherwise, does not lie in pretending that perfection exists, but in having the courage to speak honestly when boundaries are crossed. She noted that the modern world demands transparency and that the crown could no longer rely on archaic expectations of silent endurance at the expense of genuine human well-being. For generations, the default response to internal conflict has been silence, Catherine said, her voice steady and clear. You were taught that to endure in silence was the highest form of service, but Charlotte has reminded me today that silence can sometimes be mistaken for compliance. My responsibility as the Princess of Wales is to serve the public with dedication, but my highest calling as Catherine is to raise resilient, compassionate and brave children who know how to stand up for themselves and for each other. Beside her, Charlotte rested her head briefly against her mother's arm before turning to look at the host. When Marcus gently asked the young princess if she was worried about what might happen when they returned home, Charlotte offered a simple, astonishingly mature response. She shared that her father, Prince William, had always told her and her brothers that honesty requires courage, but that doing the right thing is never something to be ashamed of. Her words subtly signaled to the world that William stood firmly beside his wife and daughter in this unfolding family chapter. In the studio's gallery, phone lines were lit up continuously as senior advisors frantically tried to establish contact with the production team. Yet the crew on the floor remained motionless, captivated by the historical gravity of the broadcast. Catherine concluded the interview by reiterating her unwavering commitment to her charitable causes, particularly youth mental health, noting that emotional honesty within families is the foundational step toward building a healthier society. As Marcus Vance formally closed the broadcast and thanked both guests for their extraordinary openness, the red light on the main camera finally went off. The studio did not immediately return to its usual bustling noise. Instead, a deep, respectful quiet lingered over the set. Catherine wrapped both arms around Charlotte, pulling her into a long, tight embrace, whispering words of encouragement into her daughter's ear. Though the cameras were no longer rolling, the impact of those 30 minutes was already reverberating around the world. News outlets on every continent led with breaking bulletins, analyzing every word spoken by the young princess and the emotional response of her mother. By choosing raw honesty over rigid protocol, Catherine and Charlotte had not merely survived an unscripted crisis on live television. They had fundamentally redefined the public's relationship with the modern monarchy, setting a new precedent for vulnerability, maternal protection, and truth. The silence following the broadcast was short-lived. The moment the studio lights dimmed to signal the off-air transition, the atmosphere behind the double doors exploded into controlled chaos. Production assistants scrambled to manage ringing phones, while palace liaison officers, who had watched the disaster unfold in real time from the green room, hurried onto the set with dark, panic-stricken expressions. However, Catherine remained sitting on the sofa for several long moments, her hand still locked firmly around Charlotte's. The tears had stopped, replaced by an unmistakable stillness. She leaned down, kissing her daughter's forehead, and whispered a quiet reassurance before helping her to her feet. As the royal security detail closed in to escort them toward the private exits, Marcus Vance stood nearby, offering a low, respectful nod. He offered no dramatic commentary, recognizing that any attempt to summarize what had just transpired would only lessen its weight. Outside the studio building, the steady London drizzle had done nothing to disperse the crowd. In fact, news of the live broadcast had spread so fast via mobile alerts that small crowds were already gathering near the gates, phones held high in anticipation. Inside the security vehicle, Charlotte looked out the tinted window, watching the blur of the city pass by. Catherine pulled a soft wool blanket around her daughter's shoulders and retrieved her private phone from her handbag. It was already flashing continuously with notifications, urgent messages, and incoming calls from Kensington Palace and Balmoral alike. Yet Catherine bypassed them all, dialing a single direct line. When the call was answered on the second ring, Prince William's voice came through the speaker, not with panic or frustration, but with a deep, resolute calm. He had watched the entire broadcast from his office, and his message to his wife was simple. He stood by every single word they had spoken. Meanwhile, the media landscape was experiencing an unprecedented seismic shift. Cable news networks abandoned their planned programming to launch continuous, emergency commentary panels. Royal correspondents, accustomed to parsing cryptic palace statements and analyzing carefully choreographed public walks, were visibly stunned by the raw directness of Charlotte's disclosure and Catherine's subsequent reaction. Public sentiment across social platforms surged dramatically in favor of the Princess of Wales, with millions praising her maternal instincts and her refusal to force her young daughter into a script of artificial harmony. By late afternoon, the pressure shifted entirely to the official palace communications channels. The traditional strategy of silent endurance was no longer viable in the face of direct, live television testimony from a senior royal mother and her daughter. News outlets were demanding immediate responses regarding the claims of internal friction, title debates, and private altercations. The Crown was facing a dilemma: attempt to issue a cold, formal denial that would risk publicly invalidating a widely beloved mother and child, or acknowledge the truth of the emotional rift and risk exposing the deep structural tensions within the royal household. Back at Adelaide Cottage, the home was quiet, detached from the swirling media storm outside. Prince William met them at the door, embracing Charlotte tightly before walking with Catherine into the study. The gravity of what lay ahead was clear. They knew that the coming days would bring intense institutional pushback, emergency meetings behind closed doors, and difficult conversations across generations of the family. Yet, as the sun began to set over the damp grounds of Windsor, the heavy, suffocating blanket of secrecy that had hung over their private lives for years had finally been lifted. Catherine sat by the fire, watching her children play in the adjacent room, knowing that whatever challenges followed, the truth had finally been spoken.